Welcome back to the InterDrone Podcast, your 30,000-foot view of the commercial drone industry. My name is CJ Smith. It is Tuesday, September 15th. Joined today with Michael Pehel, the chairman of InterDrone, and our guest today, Mark McKinnon. He's a partner at the firm Fox Rothschild. Mark has over 3 decades of experience in aviation, transportation law. For our listeners, if you wouldn't mind just briefly telling them kind of who you are and some of the work you do in drones and UAS.
Yeah, so I have been working in aviation law. This is actually the 30th anniversary of my my entry private practice, and my first job right out of I clerked for a federal judge, and then my first job was working with Mark Dombroff and his aviation practice. He used to be the head of the civil division at Justice Department, and he was in charge of the tort claims against the government, primarily aviation and maritime claims. So he had a big aviation practice at the time, and I still work with him after 30 years, and it's fun. So it's kind of funny, where the world takes you. I originally took the job because I wanted to move to Washington, and I figured, well, I'll find something else to do once I get to Washington.
Sure.
And then 30 years later, I'm still working with him because the work is, the work is always interesting. As I said, it was primarily an aviation accident practice, so I worked on almost all the major airline crashes from the late 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, TW 800, the 9/11 litigation, US Air Flight 427, US Air Flight 405. There was a lot of work back in those days because they crashed a lot of planes back in those days. And obviously, as we know, there hasn't been a major plane crash in quite a long time now. So as aviation became safer and safer, the practice broadened. We did a lot more FAA enforcement and compliance work because the FAA, moved in heavily into enforcement and compliance as a way to try and make the aviation system safer. So I wound up transitioning into doing a lot of that kind of work. And then, since I was doing a lot of FAA regulatory enforcement, rulemaking issues, things like that, since around 2012, when the Reauthorization Act, the first major change to UAS law, came out, it was just a natural outgrowth, and I got involved in working on COAs for public institutions and things like that, and then that transitioned into the 333 world and aircraft certification, and now as we're moving past these baby steps, I've been doing a lot of work on UAS air carrier issues, because if as all of the big companies have found out, if you want to deliver packages commercially or you want to be involved in commercial carriage, on-demand delivery, you actually have to be the same kind of Part 135 air carrier that, any large cargo operation flying, 747 cargo planes has to do. So I've been doing a lot of work on those issues and the exemptions that are needed, because obviously Part 135 isn't set up to handle unmanned aircraft just the way that the original federal aviation regulations aren't set up to handle it. So it's kind of like just a natural outgrowth. As aviation has changed, the practice has changed, and I got into UAS in a big way, and I'm still doing a lot of UAS work right now. So
great.
Before we jump into the articles, I just wanted to kind of flag something you said about Part 135 not being set up for unmanned systems, because that was, I'm no lawyer, but I got interested in it when who was the first Wing got their Part 135, and nothing in there seems to account for like the nuances of what the drone delivery flights would be. So can you kind of just bring to light what some of those kind of discrepancies that have to be worked out are?
Well, the big thing is that in terms of exemptions, is that Part 135 requires, if you're an air carrier, you have to fly a certificated aircraft. It's got to have an airworthiness certificate, a type certificate. It's got to be maintained in accordance with its type certificate. And as we all know, there really aren't any commercial, I think even now, there aren't any commercial UAS that have a type certificate. So you get exemptions from all those regulations because Part 135 and Part 121 and all of the air carrier rules have very specific maintenance requirements that all harken back to the aircraft's type certificate. So that's the main difference between them. There are some other issues with regard to some of the tangential issues. But in terms of the legal requirement, it's the airworthiness certificate for the aircraft that's the big issue. And the other interesting thing, you talk about Google Wing though, and Google Wing made a big splash because they were first out of the gate, and they said we have our Part 135. But if you look at what they got, it was a very narrow. There are different types of Part 135 certificates.
Right, four different types, right?
Basically, you're approved to operate one aircraft, with one pilot, basically, and so it was basically. I mean, they got their Part 135, but it was just in the context of their ongoing, research and development efforts. You contrast that with what UPS got, because UPS has an unrestricted Part 135. They're not operating nationwide under it, but the Part 135 they got is the exact same Part 135 that a major air carrier, airline, cargo operation would have, and it's run the same way, and it has the same flexibility as that. And as far as I know, they're still the only one that has a broad, like a real Part 135 certificate. And it makes sense because, of course, UPS runs one of the largest airlines in the world, so they have the infrastructure and the systems. You need a spec ops, you need responsible managers, there's a whole infrastructure that goes with being an airline. And so they obviously had the expertise for that, and it was relatively easy for them to reconstruct their Part 121 airline as a Part 135 cargo airline. And that's, I think that's why, the FAA was comfortable giving them the unrestricted Part 135 that nobody else has.
Right.
It's so interesting because I was thinking from the craft, but they're using an outsider. But I mean, that really doesn't make sense. It's of no importance because when they fly their cargo planes, they're probably either Boeing or Airbus anyway, right? So it's just my industry perspective saying of course the manufacturer would have to be running the logistics, but that's not the case. There's their experience in airworthiness, or not airworthiness, in air travel in general. The fact that they operate a commercial delivery airline already means that they know how to cross all the T's and dot the I's.
Right, and that's why you see. I mean, I wouldn't say that any airline has a partnership with the aircraft manufacturer, in the sense that the team in that way. But obviously, they're each heavily reliant on the other. The airline, any airline has to have Boeing or Airbus, on board providing all of the maintenance support and after-market stuff that has to be done for an airline. And so that's obviously, the same way. Unless you're somebody like, I guess. Somebody like Google, which might be more interested in just making their own. They want to control the whole supply chain. They're going to make their own aircraft, and they're going to certify their own aircraft, and they're going to fly their own aircraft. That's not a model most businesses are going to follow.
Are able to follow, right. Interesting. Well, if everyone's tuning in for the first time, we talk about a couple articles from the past week, and then we jump into the interview portion of the podcast where we'll ask Mark a few questions. So kind of talking about drone delivery, Part 135s. The first article I want to touch on, Amazon and Walmart. Their emerging drone delivery battle escalates with Zipline deals. So Walmart is partnering with drone delivery unicorn Zipline. I know they're valued at over $1 billion right now, to make on-demand deliveries of select health and wellness products early next year. This comes right off of the news last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago. Mike, I know we talked about it on this podcast about Amazon receiving their FAA approval for their prime air delivery drones, their Part 135. And then it even says that Walmart is launching Walmart Plus to kind of create some competition for the Amazon Prime membership. So when we spoke about this, I think one point that was brought up was, we're seeing some of these big companies winning, or at least moving forward first in the drone delivery kind of sector. And but then again, now we're seeing at least some competition, and these big companies can kind of trailblaze and kind of pave the way for more drone delivery to follow. So initial thoughts, Mike, what after Amazon, out here, we're hearing Walmart, what do you make of this news? And is this competition going to be really good for the drone industry?
I don't know. My perspective might be colored now based on what Mark was saying about UPS having the only kind of broad authority under Part 135 to do scale operations. So I'd assume Walmart, well, Zipline, I mean, Zipline is interesting because they kind of pick a niche area and they prove success there. But again, we're not reaching scale with them yet. So I'm just curious how much is headline grabbing or just trying to get ahead of competitors and not really knowing your exact direction yet. Which I kind of brought up the last time. You know, I want more clear direction, more money put behind these things, and basically legal certitude, which I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's definitely, a large component of, trying to build the brand and, trying to look like you're on the cutting edge. But I mean, when it comes right down to it, I mean, at least from my perspective, Amazon and Walmart are basically fighting over third at this point. That's just where they are right now, which I think is kind of ironic given Amazon, they got into this from a conceptual standpoint and wanting to develop it early. They were one of the first developers of, the concept of it. And I don't know why it's taken them so long, to really get going in the U.S. unless, there was that strategy early on where they had a vision about what they wanted to do, and the FAA was not very receptive to it. That they wanted to really push the envelope in a way that the FAA wasn't comfortable, and so there was that well-publicized, episode where they decided they were going to go, take their ball and they were going to go to England and overseas, and they were going to do their work over there. And I'm sure they learned a lot of very valuable things because, there's a lot of valuable testing that was done. But the problem is, at the end of the day, if you want to operate in the United States, no amount of working overseas is going to get you what you need to operate in the United States. Right. Because the FAA, they are the gatekeeper of the airspace. And unless you're developing something that they're comfortable with and that accommodates U.S. law, you're never going to get ahead of someone who, may have, in the case of Google and Amazon, started, about the same time or maybe a little later, but was always a very, we want to work with you. We understand that their airspace is complex. We have to kind of work our way in with manned aircraft in a safe way. And that behind the scenes collaborative effort, I think, works better than, we're, the 800-pound gorilla and we're going to tell you what's safe because we have the technical know-how that you don't have. And so there may be something behind that. Now, just because Walmart and Amazon are behind now doesn't mean that, 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I mean, a year is a decade in this business. So a couple of years from now, it's impossible to say. It may even be someone, who is not even really on the radar right now, all of a sudden has a big presence. But as I said, right now, I think, it's basically, Amazon and Walmart are trying to, show everybody that they're still in the game and that they're serious players, and that, they're working with the FAA and they have the resources behind it.
Right. And they're innovating during times of COVID and trying to create a better experience, better product for the consumer. I think it is worth noting too. So Walmart's partnering with Zipline, I think that's a little different than Amazon receiving a Part 135 approval to do their own flight operations. And also Walmart, it says that this Zipline deal follows last week's news where the retail giant would run a pilot project for delivery of grocery and household products with end-to-end delivery firm Flytrex. So they're doing a couple different things. It looks like the Zipline deal is specific to some medical and medical deliveries and health and wellness products.
Because that's their sweet spot. I mean, they've developed that infrastructure in, is it the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo?
It said Ghana for sure, but I know parts of Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, and they have a lot of experience with some very long distance beyond visual line of sight operations.
Right.
And it's a lot easier down there because the government is behind it because they need the services in places they can't get to easily, and their space is a lot less complex. So. That's one of those instances where you can really build up the hours you need to come to the United States and show a regulator that we've got 10,000 hours with this aircraft, and we've worked out all the lost link issues. We've worked out all the tracking issues. That's
sizable data set.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things we have, one of the safest airspaces in the world, considering the volume, which I think is the highest as far as density also. The thing is, the FAA is central to all of that across the entire nation. So they don't want to let go of that safety record just so Amazon could do a couple tests. Right. And that I think initially there was a real push from tech, and there was a real assumption that the tech sector, because they've created so many magical things over the last 15 years at that point, that they would be able to handle aviation just, in a way that the entrenched interests wouldn't be able to. And it doesn't seem like that panned out long term. And that I'm seeing now more of people from the tech space, smaller companies, thinking in terms of exits rather than owning things like Facebook, right? They're not going to just claim this land. I think Walmart and Amazon, they have a real economic incentive to try and make these things work, though, which is to cut out some of the carriers they have for their physical goods now. So talk about ecosystem ownership. If you could take, even if Amazon only owns, 15% of all drone and, air deliveries by drone, that's more than they own of ground deliveries now. So that's a huge profit savings for them if they're able to take a larger piece of this new pie.
Oh yeah, and that's why I have no doubt that they're in it for the long haul, because they see, this is part of their business model, their long-term business model. So, but by the same token, even a company like, like a UPS or, a FedEx or the Postal Service, they have, while they have obviously the big ground presence, that last mile delivery or the step from delivering things in a more rural environment is expensive, and so there's big cost savings for them too, even though they have a ground network to augment it with a fleet of aircraft, and then then you open up the options for regional deliveries and things like that at some point in the future.
In those hard to get areas like West Virginia, where the delivery cost because of the mountains just increases for arbitrary reasons, right? Where you could just fly a drone and get these package deliveries, small package deliveries to people faster. It's an improvement for all parties then. Right.
Or even if Mike lived in the mountains of West Virginia and I wanted to mail him a postcard, right? This USPS truck has to drive and deliver it, and it's probably not an investment. It wouldn't be a logical business investment if you were trying to make money, if you're running a business.
It's one of those things with the Postal Service. They lose a little bit on every delivery, but they make it up with the volume. So.
Right. And I mean, now more than ever, I think the Postal Service is being scrutinized, and they're maybe under more stress than they are in normal years. So, maybe Amazon's kind of starting to think ahead and what is next for parcel delivery service across the country. You should look into the history of that. In the last probably 15 years, both parties have attacked Postal Service whenever it was convenient. Like making them pay their pensions for 20 years ahead. That was one of my favorite ones. Yeah. So the Postal Service doesn't get enough respect. Yeah, they do a hard job. Well, let's jump into this next piece. Ontario man cited 13 times for flying drones over private property. This is less about specifically what happened to this gentleman, but I think more just about the legal landscape for flying drones, consumer drones at a personal level. But so this gentleman was flying it near people's houses, quoted, creeping a lot of people out. And actually the sheriff's department cited how difficult it was to track him down, because somebody would see him, they'd go to where the drone was, and now the drone's gone. And the amount of man hours it took to actually locate him and then eventually charge him. Mark, where are we with regards to flying consumer drones on a kind of legal level in this country? What can I do? What can I not do? What do you recommend for consumers who are just maybe trying to take videos, trying to take pictures in their neighborhood? And what kind of words of advice do you have for drone pilots?
Well, there are two questions here, and that's particularly when you look at this, this guy in Ontario who got cited. There are two questions that everybody has to answer. One is, do I have a legal right for my aircraft to be where it is? And then the second question is, do I have a legal right to do with my aircraft what I want to do? And those are two different questions that are answered by two different government agencies to a large extent. And I think when you read the story, one of the telling elements in it was that they contacted the police contacted the FAA about the complaints of what was going on, and the FAA didn't respond. Because as far as the FAA is concerned, this is what happened is not their problem, because there wasn't a question about whether or not he had the legal authority for the aircraft to be where it was. He wasn't violating altitude restrictions. He wasn't violating a reckless endangerment type, where he's like careless and reckless with his operation of the aircraft. It was all a question of what he was doing with the aircraft. That there was a complaint, I guess, that he was using it near someone's window with the obvious implication that he's peeping into someone's window with it, or that he was using the drone in a harassing manner where he's like, he's following people with it, or putting them under surveillance. And those things, if you do them, they're illegal for the most part, whether you do them with a drone or without a drone. Like peeping Tom, being a peeping Tom is illegal. Harassing someone is illegal. Stalking is illegal. And there was this rush, back 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, once drones started to proliferate, where everybody started to come up with, well, we need a specific drone law where we're going to stop, drone stalking, or we're going to make peeping with a drone illegal. And my position was always that those laws were stupid in a way, because the things that they were doing was making conduct that's already illegal.
Yeah.
Because the peeping Tom statute doesn't say, it's illegal only if you're using binoculars, or it's illegal only if you're using the drone. Like it doesn't matter what the means is for you to do it. If you intrude on someone in a place where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy, that's an invasion of privacy that you can sue somebody over. And it doesn't matter how you do it. And again, the same thing with stalking. I mean, stalking is illegal whether you're following them with the drone, or whether you're driving your car behind them slowly while they're walking, or whether you're hanging out at their house and harassing them. All those conducts are still illegal. So I guess the most important thing for people who want to operate on a hobby standpoint is, I guess, just to keep in the mindset that just because I'm using a drone doesn't mean I can do things that would otherwise be illegal. Somebody say, well, I'm just flying my drone and I'm just videoing, that's fine, because in the same way that just taking a picture of someone or something is legal. But there reaches a point where you cross over from, a legal conduct to a harassing conduct. And it's usually it's the reasonable expectations of the people, it's community standards. And so you just have to be mindful of what you're doing and what the local law is with regard to all of those types of things, like harassment and things like that.
To your point, we didn't write a law saying you can't video somebody unwantedly with an iPhone, and you also can't do it with an Android, and you can't do it with a handheld camera. It's all falls under the umbrella.
Right, and then obviously the other question, though, you still have to keep in mind, which is unique to drones, is am I filing whatever the new requirements? There used to be Section 336, and obviously those have been modified, and more changes are coming, to the standards to fly as a hobbyist, because Congress actually mandated that the FAA take more control over hobbyists. So those types of issues still have to be dealt with, if you're flying a drone. And then things like, flying in proximity to airports, and, so you still have to have your airspace awareness. But as I said, and that's, in this case, in the Ontario case, basically what happened is exactly what the FAA thinks should happen, because the FAA doesn't care about privacy. They're not a privacy regulator. Their position is, if you're invading somebody's privacy, that's a local matter for local law enforcement.
And a lot of that was covered in the last Reauthorization Act, right? Like clarity on who was in charge of what,
right?
Like law enforcement.
Yeah, the FAA they did a memorandum for law enforcement a couple of years ago, and I think earlier this year they basically reissued it, and they didn't really change it. And they basically was just they're reminding local law enforcement that, this is what federal law requires, but that's a separate matter from what state law requires. And we're not the drone police. Anytime somebody does something with a drone, that's not going to be our problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think, is that also the story where the county attorney made some statement to the effect that if a drone is flying over your property and you don't want it there, that you have the right to take it down? I think that was also.
Yeah, I think, that is more or less the law. Now, I think this article even stated that now in certain states, you can't necessarily go out and shoot it down. So this article said you have to be creative on how you are to take it down because, again, you have to follow the laws.
I think, as far as the FAA is concerned, it's if somebody's
that'd be a federal crime, right?
Somebody's flying a drone, you may not interfere. There's a federal crime for interfering with an aircraft in flight, and that statute does not differentiate between a manned and an unmanned aircraft. So interfering with a drone in flight is not permissible. Now, again, calling the police and having them track down the person who's doing it, that's one thing, but trying to use some means to interfere with the aircraft, I think the county attorney, at least as far as federal law is concerned, he's kind of on shaky ground telling people that, they can do things to destroy or capture the aircraft when it's illegally operating in, federal airspace.
It's interesting that we're still kind of having these discussions, right?
Well, and part of the issue, though, is, to a certain extent, people have that impression that they can do that.
Yeah, my property. Yeah.
Right, where, for whatever reason, the federal government has decided they're not going to get involved. And then the local, state's attorney or county attorneys decided they're not going to prosecute. So even though technically, a crime is committed, if nobody prosecutes it, nothing happens.
Well, yeah, enforcement is always the issue, right? Even for the FAA enforcing legal flights of drones, period, right? So then they're definitely not going to want to take on the responsibility of chasing down what is criminal activity for what is considered a legal flight.
Yeah.
So let me get this straight. So if it's above my private property, I am allowed to take it down. But if it's
not according to the FAA. And think about this. Like, you can't take down a helicopter just because it's over your property. But there are, people have been kind of sold the illusion. It's like a myth that if you talk to people, because I remember when I was first flying drones around here, that they own their property into the sky. It was a beam, like a square beam that went straight up, never mind that circumference gets larger as you go up, but
right.
Yeah, because in fact there was a case, it goes back, I think, to the 30s. It's actually a Supreme Court case where there's a very eloquent discussion about how, that used to be the law under ye olde English common law, that you owned the ground up to the heavens. And the Supreme Court specifically says that we're not doing that anymore because otherwise it would be impossible to operate aircraft. That, the airspace is going to be federal and it's going to be operated by the federal government. And in fact, there's a federal statute that gives the federal government sovereignty over the airspace of the United States. And there's no height limit on that statute. It's basically, the statute says the federal government controls from the ground all the way up to the sky. Now, you get into those really tricky questions sometimes about, if I own land, if I don't own at least some of the rights to use the space above the land, my land is useless.
How do I build a house?
Right. Yeah. 6 inches.
Well, there were some discussions early on about where does your property start? It's like the top of the blade of grass,
Well, the Supreme Court, there's a famous case, involving, I don't know if you want to get into it, but involving chickens right after World War II. It was a chicken farmer, and the Army at the time, because it was the Army Air Corps, they built a runway to operate large 4-engine bombers out of, and the flight path, the takeoff and landing path, was right over this guy's farm where he kept chickens. And the noise and vibration from these bombers passing over at all hours of the day and night was so bad that basically the chickens would get so terrified that they would fly into the walls, and they were literally killing themselves. And so this guy sued. The guy sued the government and said, "Look, I want an injunction there. This is my property, and you can't fly over it." And the Supreme Court kind of split the baby, and they said that, as we were talking, ownership of the land obviously gives you an interest in the airspace of some kind. Otherwise, your land is useless. But the government still controls how the airspace is used. So if the government's use of your airspace is so invasive and so pervasive that the land has no value to you, it's no different than if they just took your land and built a runway on your property, that it's a taking at that point. And then they have to compensate you. So that's ultimately what they did to this guy. He couldn't stop the bombers, but basically the government had to buy him out and compensate him. Right, they treated it as a taking. So at least and that was basically the last word from the Supreme Court. So the way the law stands is people have an interest in what they call the immediate reaches. And in the case of the chicken coop, it was between 60 and 80 feet. It's generally also considered to be, if a tree is going to be there, aircraft really can't operate anyway. So what you would expect to be the maximum height of a tree, is the immediate reaches. But as I said, that's nobody. I'm sure it's coming. It has to come someday. Well, there'll be a Supreme Court case where they'll finally nail down how far your interest goes. But that's also why a lot of this fight about whether or not property owners own the land over their property actually is taking place in Congress. There was the move a couple of years ago, where they just wanted to split off ownership of the airspace below 200 feet and give that back to the states. So like the state would exercise sovereignty over it, or that the states would have some kind of trusteeship, that they would basically, use the airspace for the individual landowners, and they would have the rights to, intervene. I know the Congress has expressed a number of times that they want the FAA to take state and local governments' interests more into account when they are divvying up the below 400 feet airspace. So we'll see. We're only, always one election away from a major change in how the airspace is, and you could easily get in the not too distant future, somebody saying, well, okay, we're gonna give all of that airspace to the states, and now we're gonna have 50 states are going to decide how the airspace is used, and all these dreams of having beyond visual line of sight package delivery nationwide are going to be have to accommodate 50 different state laws or even local laws at that point. Because I know there's also talk about how, it shouldn't be the state level, it should be at the county level or the city level. And that obviously makes it even more complicated.
Yeah. Oh, no, please no.
No.
Too much detail.
Right. But then it might be easier just to fly your drone, take the long route, just so you're going over counties or jurisdictions where the law is favorable. Maybe more cheaper that way.
That was the fear when people started talking more in terms of state and local municipalities having kind of their hat thrown into the ring on what their airspace looks like.
Right. All right. Well, speaking of BVLOS, I want to jump into our final article, and then we'll ask Mark a few questions. But North Dakota building a statewide BVLOS network for drones. So this is taking place at the Northern Plains UAS test site. 3 leading aviation infrastructure companies, Collins Aerospace, L3 Harris Technology, and Thales USA. They were selected to develop and employ a physical infrastructure for the network, and the test site selected Valancy's Volley C-10, which is a vertical takeoff and landing and fixed wing aircraft. They selected this for site acceptance testing and use case development. So, I think this is really exciting. Obviously, BVLOS flights, kind of one of the kind of coveted frontiers of the drone industry, and I think ultimately that's what these UAS test sites are for and should be for, is kind of developing this technology and getting this data. So, for either of you, what do you guys kind of think about this news? And maybe in general, how is the USA kind of comparing to some of the other countries when it comes to BVLOS flight and remote ID and some of these other kind of technological frontiers that can really progress the industry?
I'd say it depends on who you ask. There's some staunch defenders of where the U.S. is as far as making the right choices at the right times and being disciplined about not just, opening up the genie's bottle. And then, there's people who might say that Europe is, light years ahead of us. But, it tends to go back and forth where progress is made and then something gets kind of halted over there. I remember Swiss Post, they were doing delivery tests in Zurich, and they had, I think, 2 crashes in a short period of time, and then things got closed down for a while. Right. So, it takes a village. It's going to take a lot of data. And I think BVLOS, the story is never going to be won first in the United States. I think people just have to accept that, just because we're dealing with a very complicated airspace, and that it's actually better for us if that it's proven overseas, and with our kind of scale and power on afterwards, just borrowing the right answers and scaling them upwards.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it is funny the way Europe has kind of developed and almost had a change of heart from the early heady days. Because early on, EASA, the European regulator, they decided that drones, because of the way they operate, are a local issue, and we're going to let each country they're free to do whatever they want in that airspace, and there won't be any European drone rule. And then as a result, you saw some countries, leap ahead and, get really heavy into doing BVLOS and other types of research and things like that. And then, all of a sudden, EASA realized that, well, maybe this is a little bit more complicated than we thought. And, while countries, have done a good job of pushing the boundaries, we need a more European standard. And so now, they have this EASA overlay, which I guess was supposed to finally be going to its implementation. I think it was in May or June. And then because of COVID, that got delayed, and I don't know when the current implementation date is. I think it's later this fall or around December, but who knows, where we'll be with that. So as a result, it's their early lead has now kind of retrenched into a new set of regulations that they've taken a number of years to develop, and just once they have this more European framework, there's still going to be a lot of work that's done to come up with the implementing rules. So, just because there's going to be this EASA framework, the actual, day-to-day operations and how things are going to be run are still going to be developed. And, there isn't going to be, the day the regulation goes into effect that everybody's just flying BVLOS. There's a lot of, work that starts to look like what's going on in the U.S. with the test sites and, the various partnership for safety programs and, the IPP. And, that's the way kind of some of these, implementing efforts in Europe start to look. So, at the end of the day, I think, everybody's probably in about the same place, in terms of having having that day where there's a widely accepted technical standard and regulations to support it, and everybody knows what they can do and just buy something off the shelf and go fly.
Right.
What about
in North Dakota? Obviously, is a very important step, on that road, because it's one of the quick things. The FAA's got to come up with regulations for it, but there has to be a consensus standard that to support the regulations, and so there's always that. They have to be developed in parallel.
Right.
What about the APAC region, Mark? Do you see progress happening there first?
Yeah, Singapore.
I know Michael Blades has shown a lot of interest in that kind of region making strides. Or is it you're just not knowledgeable about what's going on over there?
They are making strides, and I think it wouldn't surprise me if a country, someplace like Singapore or someplace which has a less complex, very manageable airspace, the West, the more developed countries, that they're the first with a comprehensive BVLOS UTM system. Because it's just easier to manage both geographically and technologically. You don't have as much risk involved with it. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's where you see the first, but obviously the most robust system, is going to be later.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like progress in this kind of in this region or this kind of department is not linear by any means. So we're going to take it in chunks. And exciting to see this progress. I mean, like I said, that's what these test sites are for. And I wonder if COVID's accelerated some of this kind of this testing and both here and across the world. So
No, I think COVID, it's in terms of the regulatory impact of it and the legal impact of it. Obviously it set everybody back right away because once everybody was shut down, a lot of non-essential testing and things like that really are not going on. But once it was apparent that we're going to be in this for a while, you started to see the FAA and other people ease up and make waivers available on a more expedited basis and allocating more. So I think overall, I think it has a beneficial impact on the loosening up of regulations and the ability to progress and at least at a lower scale.
Yeah, I would think that would eventually come to play the longer that this gets drawn out, just because there's less flights, right? So that means there's kind of less of the day-to-day grind that the FAA has to be concerned with commercial air travel.
Right. Well, I think a parallel too. I mean, Mike and I live in New York, and we know the city is doing a lot of infrastructure work kind of during these times, whether it's subway, whether it's, kind of pushing forward.
Right,
LaGuardia
stuff that
Airport.
couldn't happen, yeah.
Yeah, and so you wonder, maybe the FAA or obviously, the test sites and different companies are using this opportunity to kind of build out some of that infrastructure that's, you can kind of work on it a little quicker now, maybe with just, like you said, less traffic in the skies, or the FAA is allowing some testing that they maybe wouldn't have pre-COVID. Let's shift into the interview portion, Mike. I want to ask a couple questions about kind of your thoughts, and again, look at things through a little bit of a legal lens. So we talked about kind of how you made your way into the drone space. You have a lot of experience, obviously, aviation transportation law. Can you kind of compare and contrast the legal and regulatory landscapes between traditional aviation and transportation law, and then kind of where we are in with drones and UAS?
Well, I think the most important thing when you talk about the drone regulation versus the regulation of the other parts of the airspace is that there really isn't any difference. As far as the FAA is concerned, all drones or aircraft, they all have to comply with all of the federal aviation regulations, and maybe on a one-off basis through things like exemptions or waivers or things like that, will allow things to be done that the main rules don't permit. But yeah, again, even with that, we talk about exemptions and waivers, and everybody who's in the drone world, knows that there was this program, the 333 exemptions and things like that, which were aimed specifically at drones. But the fact is that actually is a minor part of a very broad exemption process that the FAA has. And that exemption process, basically any federal aviation regulation, can be waived or you can get an exemption for and you use the same process that you went through for your 333 exemption. You tell the FAA what you want to do. You tell the FAA what regulations need to be exempted or changed or modified for you to do it, and then you explain to them why what you're doing is just as safe as if you were following the regulations. It's that equivalent level of safety. And so that process is used by helicopter operators and other large aircraft, small aircraft, all the time. If they want to modify an aircraft for photography or some other things that you go through basically an exemption type process to be allowed to do those things. So even with that, when we're talking about exemptions and waivers and things like that, it's very much the exact same overlay that the FAA uses for all other aviation work. So, and again, in terms of like enforcement and compliance, there aren't special enforcement and compliance rules for unmanned aircraft. If you do something with your unmanned aircraft that's careless and reckless, you violate the federal aviation regulations around Part 91. You're in the exact same enforcement and compliance system as if you were flying a helicopter or an airliner. It's the exact same regulations, the exact same laws, the exact same enforcement handbook is going to be used by the enforcement people to determine what the appropriate penalty is going to be. It's the same, appeal process to the ALJ and then ultimately to the NTSB. So again, it's, people who operate drones, sometimes think that they're like in a special compartment,
right?
But you're not. You're literally in the same system that everybody else is in.
And is that by design, or is that just because that's the easiest way to regulate until we have kind of separate frameworks or separate methodologies to regulate drones?
I think it's actually by design. I think early on, the FAA decided that since drones were going to be treated as aircraft, that the entire airspace system was not going to be modified to basically support them. They had
to accommodate them.
Like anybody else who had an experimental aircraft, you've got to be able to fit into the airspace. They're not going to create a new system just for you. And part of that is also, I think, as a practical matter, the FAA and the aviation industry has spent decades literally trying to establish the principles about federal preemption and federal control of the airspace. And if you treat drones as something separate, that they're not part of the airspace and they're not aircraft, then you run, I think, a greater risk of people saying, well, it should be, there should be less federal control, there should be more state and local, operations. And I think the FAA, both from a safety and philosophical standpoint, said these are aircraft. We're gonna treat them as federal, and we're gonna apply federal law to them under the exact same principles as everything else. So as I said, I think it was intentional, particularly when you look at if you look at the briefing back. I don't know if you guys remember the Perker case. That was probably the first major enforcement action. This was back 2013, 2014. It was Mr. Perker was flying his aircraft at a university. It was University of Virginia, and he actually got cited for careless and reckless behavior, and it went to an ALJ, and he convinced the ALJ that his drone was not an aircraft and therefore was exempt from the federal aviation regulation. And so the FAA, obviously, they appealed that ruling to the NTSB. And so there was a lot of, that was really early on. There's a lot at stake in that case. If they'd have lost that case, then basically the FAA would have been without authority to regulate drones, period.
That would be the precedent moving forward.
And so if you read the NTSB's opinion in that case, it's very strong, and makes very forcefully the argument that because these are aircraft, the FAA has complete control over it. So as I said, that was kind of the framework for the FAA's involvement. They were running the risk that basically the entire system of drones would be taken away. Yeah. And I think they looked at that as it's not just one of these power grabs. It's, that they think control of the airspace as a unit is necessary for safety. And so they really do not want to lose control of that component of it.
I mean, that really makes sense too, if you think about, because clearly that aircraft at that time, that's 6 years ago, the leaps and bounds in progress we've made since then. If they were to deem that as okay, there would be a whole slew of evolutionary aircraft after that would not be under the FAA's purview. Right. So you essentially get dueling airspaces and authorities. I don't understand how or a group of federal kind of institutions would be able to come to any other conclusion than the one they did, really, without saying that they're going to allow it to be the Wild West. Things don't normally go in that direction of less oversight, right?
And you can also see that, the FAA has, ever since Section 336 came out, they were very vociferous and took all the actions they could to make sure that hobbyists were not carved out as well. And, they've obviously had some success with that, where, they basically repealed 336 and told the FAA that they could set some standards, and that in the future, they could actually set more standards and more restrictions that they feel necessary if they go through, the appropriate rulemaking and things like that. Because under 336, they said you will make no rule regarding an unmanned aircraft that's for recreational purposes. And obviously that didn't sit very well with their philosophy.
Yeah, on the point of waivers, Mark, I was reading one of your articles on jdsuper.com. You mentioned the Part 107 drone waivers, the majority of which have an expiration of 48 months, and we're kind of approaching that fourth year anniversary of the issuance of these waivers, and the expiration dates are approaching. So what happens next?
Well, I said the FAA, I think it was actually at the first FAA symposium that was back in July. They actually had as part of their program that they were rolling out an expedited process that you could use for certain of the waivers to get renewed. And that was primarily, I guess, in the context of the because of course the bulk of the waivers are for night operation and things like a relatively simple one. So basically, I think if I remember correctly, it had to do with if you were going to follow the criteria for the rulemaking that's currently underway, which I guess we'll see hopefully the end of in December.
They say they're still on time, right?
Yeah, that's what they say. So I'm sure that they were delayed by COVID to a certain extent, but I think they can probably get it done.
It's usually last hour of the year.
Yeah, exactly.
That's been a pattern lately.
Yeah. But so that's what I think was the context of it. It's an expedited process until the new rule comes out. Because then in theory, when the new rule comes out, the bulk of the waivers that deal with things like flight over people or night operations, you won't need a waiver anymore because it'll actually be a rule. So
right.
It's kind of a stopgap to fill this hole of the expiring waivers until the new rule comes out.
Sure. Right. Interesting. Interesting point you just were making earlier is, consumer hobbyist drones versus enterprise. On this podcast, Mike, we've had this discussion that should enterprise use cases, enterprise aircraft drones be regulated, classified? Should they follow the same rules as consumer drones? Do they all need to be on the same remote ID network? If that is the path we're going to go forward with, just want to know what you guys think about that, and do we need to classify them separately?
Well, I think enterprise or commercial drone users are kind of the ones that get screwed the most, no matter what, because they're usually the most well-behaved, but also
and have to follow the most rules.
All the targets are on them. But hobbyists are not happy about what was essentially kind of open world to them up until this mass-produced technology. Because if you think about hobbyist aviation, there's people like my friend Adam who builds or works for aircraft manufacturer now, who is building basically model aircraft. These are one-offs, they're kits or whatever. You have to be certain, you're knowledgeable, you're really interested in it enough, and you have to kind of find a field where other people can teach you, or there was basically some self-regulating factors that completely got eliminated by drones. Being so easily accessible, and any idiot can get it up in the sky very, very fast. But yeah, it's been interesting watching it evolve over the years. But I like to see more clarity, so enterprises as soon as possible, so enterprises can start scaling with confidence, because it's been hard to get enterprise uptick, because enterprises take a long time to procure new technologies or even advanced programs in normal circumstances
with clear regulation.
Right. So without it, they'll be more tepid in their response, and I think that's kind of what we've seen. There's been kind of a lot of false starts in this industry, because I think the promise is clear, the ROI is clear. It's just whether or not you could actually get it done legally, safely, and at scale. Those three questions are not answered yet from the regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, and the one thing which I guess I was a little surprised of when we were looking at when the rulemaking came out, and there was for the UTM, for the remote ID standard, and that there wasn't uniformity in the industry even about whether or not the approach the FAA was taking was appropriate. Because I think, you saw there was that open letter that Wing and some other large players did, and I think there was another open letter, maybe not even that long ago, where the AMA and Wing and some other people actually joined together, basically tell the FAA that they think that the approach that they're taking is not necessarily the right one. And I don't know. I guess it's one of those things where you're never going to make everybody happy. But I would think when you have the Academy of Model Aeronautics and Wing together saying that they think that there's an issue with the approach that they're taking, that maybe that causes people at the FAA to have second thoughts. And of course, the big problem is that to the extent the FAA has second thoughts, it pushes everything back, because you probably would have to almost have another notice of proposed rulemaking if they come up with, during this rulemaking process, if they don't go forward with the proposal they have and they decide to do something that's radically different, you can't just bait and switch. You have to start another rulemaking.
Yeah, from scratch, which loses time. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody has the stomach for that, particularly at the FAA. I don't think they really, want to take another year now.
They want it over too. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of interesting that so many parties seem unhappy, though. I think
right.
that's a hard thing to overcome. I think one of the things that none of the commercial or hobbyist parties, which, I mean, when we really think about it, like, these are the end users. These are going to be the people on the front lines of whatever future we have. They're not thinking in terms of the national defense perspective, which really, really shades aviation in ways that it doesn't shade something like, phone production or something simpler. Like, this industry is unique in that perspective that anything in the sky can easily turn into a deadly weapon if used incorrectly.
Right. And I think the thing we all kind of forget, because it seems like ancient history now, is that there was a remote ID proposal that got really close to the finish line years ago, and it got all the way to OIRA, at the White House for review. And law enforcement came in and said, look, we need a more robust way to be able to tell who's doing what and whether they have a right to be there or not there. And that caused, probably almost a 1.5 or 2 year delay, from where we are today. So, again, those concerns, people who are talking about it from a technical standpoint and a civil liberties standpoint, tend to lose sight of the fact that, law enforcement and the national security apparatus has already made their position known that they want as robust and comprehensive a system as possible.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly, amazing, though, to be part of something is that hotly debated, right? Where the interests are that entrenched. It really does mean that this is an innovative technology, or otherwise people wouldn't want to be, or institutions or even private institutions would not want to be giving up an inch of ground because they think that's the difference between measures of success. Look, we just saw a law enforcement example. They're literally running around town like the Keystone Cops, not because they are the Keystone Cops, but because there is no way for them to really get access to that person efficiently.
Right.
Mark, I'm excited to get your take on this, but what do you think is holding the industry back? We asked this question to a lot of people we have on the podcast, many of which are entrepreneurs, maybe business owners, and they're quick to say regulation, but I'm excited to kind of get legal counsel's perspective on this.
Well, to a certain extent, I think, from their perspective, I can see why they would say regulations, because they have what they think is a solution.
Yeah, right. A little bias.
But the problem is that the FAA looks at these things and they're like, okay, well, you say you have a solution, but you have to prove to me that you have a solution. Oh, and therefore other people, and they think they have a solution that's completely different from yours. And then we also have the legacy stakeholders, the airlines and, the Pilots Association and, other entities, which, you can say you have a solution, but unless they're convinced that solution is going to allow them to do what they've been doing for decades safely, they're not interested in, just going willy-nilly with what you say. So I think it's just, the technology can't be implemented without the regulations, but the regulations can't proceed unless they're proven to work. And so it really is, it's this constant race of, finding a solution and then the regulators saying, well, okay, that's a solution, but have you considered this? And going back and saying, okay, well, now we have a solution to what your other concern was, and then once all that's worked out, then there's the part that gets really frustrating because federal law requires any rulemaking to proceed through this notice and comment. And if it's a big issue like we see with, the UTM standards and things like that, you get tens of thousands of comments. And by federal law, the FAA can't say, well, we like our rules, so the hell with the comments. They got to read them all. They got to digest them all, and they actually have to respond to them all. They don't respond to them individually, but if to the extent people are raising points, they got to actually have a reasoned response to, yes, we understand that this is your concern, but we don't think it's a concern because of X. And when you get tens of thousands of comments, that takes a long time. And, people think, oh my God, this rulemaking is being, it's going to be a year. Like, that's light speed for a rulemaking like this. Usually it's a year and a half to 2 years for something, as big as this. Mm-hmm. So, and I can understand that does seem like the roadblock, because you've reached a point where everybody thinks they know what the solution is, but now we have to wait for the actual rulemaking process to go. Mm-hmm. But if you had people who had a solution and the FAA said, okay, we're going with that, everybody would scream bloody murder, because they're like, well, I have a right to be heard, and I think you're wrong because of X. So
yeah, the FAA can't win unless they pick your company. Right. The company, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, though the chicken and egg nature of that, to me, just speaks to Zipline's success outside the United States, right? And I really do think, after years of watching this, that we will most likely come up with the right answer here. But I don't think we're going to be the first examples of true innovative uses of this technology at any scale. I just think we're going to see it elsewhere.
Maybe that's the route. Maybe we let it develop elsewhere, and we take it when it's ready.
Well, to a certain extent, it's like, again, the data has to be there, and the data is hours. It's got to be thousands and thousands and thousands of hours proving it. And, it doesn't matter where those hours come from. Mm-hmm. And that's why things like, the public-private partnerships and the PSPs and this, the test sites have been a great idea, because they've allowed people to create, the hours that are needed to validate these concepts. But as I said, there's plenty of other opportunities to get hours overseas and then bring that data in and, have the FAA say, okay, you have 50,000 hours on this engine. It's a great engine. We're going to go ahead and certify it.
Mark, from your perspective, where do you see the technology kind of ultimately going? What will drone technology look like in the United States in the next year, next 5 years? What would you like to see?
Well, I don't know. In the next year, I think it looks a lot like what we've seen now, because, as I said, I think, the flight over people rule, we're not going to see until, probably the end of the year or the beginning of next year. And then really, I mean, the next big leap has to have, unmanned traffic management and beyond visual line of sight. And, we're nowhere near even a rulemaking on, how that system's going to work. So I think we're at least a couple of years away before the rules are set and you can deploy a large system like that. So, mm-hmm. In 5 years, I would hope that we actually have, a UTM and beyond visual line of sight rules that everybody can follow. And we have a number of aircraft that actually have airworthiness certificates, that we've actually been able to set those standards and decide what the consensus standard is and work all the way through the process. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of options available for people who want to use the system. But I think ultimately, 20 years from now, I think the ultimate shape of it is, and you see this now with commercial airlines, both Airbus and Boeing. I mean, the plane can basically fly itself. But the mm-hmm. fact is that nobody wants the plane to fly itself. Nobody
right.
People watch, the Tesla, run into the parked car and they say, we don't trust automation. But I mean, that's ultimately, I think, where you wind up with is, at least, I don't know if passengers will ever be, satisfied not having a human in the cockpit. But for cargo operations, I'm sure we'll have a day where, you have a large airliner that's just, basically a drone. It flies itself. Yeah. That's going to work under, international rules, and IATA and things like that are going to be, behind setting up what the regulatory framework of that looks like. Mm-hmm. But I think that's ultimately where we go. We just a very large scale drone.
Right. Right. And I know, Mike, you've talked about the middle mile delivery a lot, and maybe that's kind of the first foray we can take into some of this, take the next step in some of these delivery operations.
Yeah. And, I still see Blades talking about that consistently about, large scale delivery, freight level delivery being kind of the first, well, it's the middle mile on the chain, but the kind of first mile of accomplishment. Because even if the margins are low, like Chris Anderson has said on our podcast, there's still larger margins larger total volume in dollars.
There's large quantity. Yeah.
To be had there than on individual drone operations. And that's, the other thing that I always bring home, and I wonder what you think about this, Mark. We have a lot of commercial operations now that are just fine, and they're probably not going to need to scale much larger, like construction work.
Right.
You would see more of occurrences of them, but like it's not like they're going to be flying 50 drones over a construction site. Do you feel like we're already there on that stuff, or that there's anything holding back those fields too?
No, I think there definitely are a lot of use cases, and maybe it's the use cases that were developed under the 333, the visual line of sight operations. There's a lot of productive work that doesn't benefit from more advanced rules for the most part. Photography, a lot of those types of things. Volumetric analysis work, that type of stuff. There's a lot of work that's being done, and I think the marginal increase in the effectiveness and value of that work is very small compared to just being able to open up the capacity and the capability for things that can't be done now, like your true power line and pipeline patrols where you're going hundreds of miles down the line, that kind of stuff.
Right. Any final thoughts, Mark, for the InterDrone audience?
No, I think the main thought is as frustrating as things can be, when you look back, particularly, and it's particularly during the COVID days where every day seems like it's just the same day over and over again. That really, we've come an exceptional distance, since 2012, where basically there was no legal basis to fly, period. If you had your drone out and you wanted to take a picture of your house because you wanted to sell it, that was illegal and there was no path forward. That's, I think, to go from that to where we are now, where you have, widespread commercial operations, and you're looking, at, some of these, beyond visual line of sight package delivery work that's being done on the small scale. It's really remarkable that we're where we are. So, don't give up hope. I guess the future's coming.
Yeah.
It's just a day away. So.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for taking the time and being here today. If anybody is looking to subscribe to the InterDrone podcast, you can go to InterDrone.com. This will be on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud. If you are watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit subscribe, ring the bell, sign up for alerts, and Mark will put some of your contact information down below just so people can get in touch and follow up. And we look forward to seeing you at InterDrone online December 15th through 17th on the World Wide Web. So thanks again for being here, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks a lot.